a very warm welcome. I'm Helen Rees and I'm the chair for this session. This session is called Blurred Lines, What is Consent? And this is absolutely the right place to start a session on everyday liberties because consent is a crucial concept in the law. It's been described as working its moral magic to turn the most horrendous crimes into harmless, even pleasurable activities. And perhaps there's no better example than the one that we're focusing on today, which is that consent turns the crime of rape into sex, good, bad, or indifferent. So that's where we're starting. But as the panel, the title suggests, do we actually know what consent is? Is that a very straightforward question, or is that a very difficult question? And to help us to answer that question, to grapple with consent, I am truly delighted to welcome this panel. It's always a pleasure to chair, but I'm particularly delighted today because I have huge respect for every member of this panel. So I'm going to tell you who they are and in a sentence why that is. And I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. So we're going to start with Barbara Hewson, who many of you will know as she's spoken at the Battle of Ideas before. She's a barrister who specialises in human rights, women's rights, and the way that she's expressed this is that she's concerned to challenge the current culture of victimhood. And I think it's fair to say that on occasion she's been known to put the cat amongst the pigeons. So I'm really delighted to welcome Barbara. Then we're going to turn to David Gurnham. And David Gurnham, as a fellow academic, is a colleague of mine in the broad sense. And he knows that I'm a huge fan of his written work. And I've been particularly interested, I've been really enjoying his recent work where he interrogates the notion that culture is obsessed with rape myth acceptance, victim blame, sexist stereotypes. So I'll be very interested to hear what he's got to say on this. Then we move to Cathy Young, who will also be known to many of you. She's a journalist and an author. Her book, Ceasefire, Why Women and Men Must Join Forces to Achieve Equality, is one of my favourite books that I've read in the last few years. And the thing that really strikes me about her book, and also her journalism, is it's just packed full of common sense and good reason. And she writes a column entitled Real Clear Thinking, and I think that's very appropriate. Then we move on to Matthew Scott, who is a barrister with over 25 years of experience in the criminal courts. I know him through his blog, barristerblogger.com, and I'm not really a blog person, I'm too old for that. But this is one blog that I really enjoy because it cuts through so much prejudice, so much unclear thinking, and really tells us what matters about debates in the law. So I'm delighted to have him. And finally, Luke Gittos, who will be known to many of you, who's, among other things, legal editor of Spiked and the author of a recent book entitled Why Rape Culture is a Dangerous Myth, and he's got lots to say of value. And just before I pass over, just to say that all the panel will be speaking for about 5 minutes each, and then I'm going to go straight out to the audience for you to take them up and challenge them. And I just want to finish with just one sentence, really, to say why I've got huge respect for all the panellists. And that's because one thing they've all got in common is they're all very gutsy, they're all very brave, they've all stuck their necks out and challenged things that many people take for granted. And of course that's part of what we're here for at the Battle of Ideas. So I'm going to sit back and enjoy watching them stick their necks out. Over to Barbara.
Thanks very much. Well, I thought I'd start by setting the scene and talking about consent in a fairly general sort of way. I think everyone on the panel and in this room would agree that sexual relations are only morally and legally permissible if both parties consent. And what we're being asked to think about today is what is consent. It's very commonly said that no means no, and I think everyone would agree with that too. But what exactly does yes mean, and when does yes operate, and how does it operate? Is consent a state of mind, or is it an act? there's a huge amount of anxiety about consent at the moment, particularly in the sphere of higher education. University campuses now insist that freshers students have consent classes before they're allowed to start their studies. And I expect some of the other speakers will tell you a bit more about those. But what are the core components of consent? Thinking about it, what you need is firstly a free consent that's given voluntarily. Second, and this may be rather more contentious, you need an informed consent, and I'll explain a bit more about that. And then finally, you need a competent consent, that the person must be of full age and legal capacity. Informed consent in the sphere of sexual relations is plainly not the same as informed consent in a medical context. Say, when someone's planning on having an operation or something of that kind, they need to know before they embark on it the pros and the cons, the risks, the benefits, and what happens if you don't go ahead. Consent in the sphere of interpersonal relationships doesn't have to be in writing. You don't need to keep a record of it in the way that a doctor does. And of course, it can be given informally. One of the problems we've got at the moment with the current approach in some universities to consent is there seems to be this idea that consent shouldn't be that informal. It should be ascertained in a very programmed way. A story came out this week suggesting that students are now being told in some universities that if you're engaged in a sexual encounter, you should check that your partner is consenting every 10 minutes, which might make those encounters quite interesting with people watching the clock. The issue of capacity to consent is actually set quite low, and what the law requires is that you understand the mechanics of the act, that there are some health risks involved, the possibility of acquiring a sexual infection, and then finally that sex between a man and a woman may result in a pregnancy. Now, there's a problem with autonomy here, because if you are very prescriptive about consent, what you may end up doing is restricting the autonomy of both parties who want to engage in a sexual encounter, because you're making it difficult for them to exercise their wish to have sex together. And there are interesting questions about deception and coercion, which I think we'll probably tease out during the course of this discussion. I'm not going to say too much about that, but there's some interesting scenarios about if you don't know the identity of the person you're having sex with, is it rape if they turn out not to be the person you think they are? And I'll just leave you with that cliffhanger so that the rest of the panel can have their say.
Oh, that's it. Fantastic. Yes. Thank you. Straight on to David.
Okay, so we're here to talk about consent, as Barbara has said. So the question we need to start with is, do we have a problem when it comes to consent? I think, yes, we do. Are there blurred lines when we think about consent? I think emphatically yes, and that's why we're all here. Otherwise, I think we might as well go home. But to know that we have got a problem, that there is a problem with consent, I think all we need to do is look at what the Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, has said recently about it. Alison Saunders, she's a very important woman because she's in charge of prosecutions in this country and policy regarding what cases get prosecuted. She says, consent is widely understood. We all know what it is. It's as easy as, quote, knowing if someone wants a cup of tea. And if you haven't seen it already, there's a very funny and clever animation that accompanies her message on consent. Me and my wife had a lot of fun watching this. It's very amusing, but the problem is it's wrong. And I'll explain why that is now. So she says it's very widely understood, everyone knows what it is, it's easy, but at the same time, our attitudes are dominated by rape myths and sexist stereotypes that confuse us and mislead us about what consent is. Okay, so she makes these 2 points about consent. It's easy, and yet we don't know what it is actually. This is a confusing picture, and it's a bit worrying that the Director of Public Prosecutions makes this case. Now, what I want to try and convince you of is that to understand why we're in such a pickle about consent, we need to understand 2 things. Firstly, and this might come as a bit of a surprise, but I think it's true, that the radical feminists in the 70s and 80s were right when they said that inequality gets eroticized in sex life, in our culture. At the heart of what a lot of people find sexy about sex is inequality and domination. Okay, that's an uncomfortable fact, I think, but it's something that the radical feminists were right to say. The second thing is that when we consent to sex, we might do so for a whole range of reasons. Only one of those reasons is that at that particular moment, we actually want to have sex. Okay, so you might consent for a whole range of other reasons, but it doesn't mean your consent is invalid. It just means you're not fulfilling the romantic ideals about consent that we have and about sex. So these are the two things I think that if you can accept, you will find consent becomes a bit clearer, or the problem of consent becomes a bit clearer. But however, we hardly ever hear this admitted in public debates. The liberal left are too worried about saying anything that sounds politically incorrect. For example, that a lot of men find female vulnerability sexy, that a lot of women find the idea of dominant masculinity sexy. You will not find that written in The Guardian, for example. The political right are reluctant to admit that anything useful can come from feminism, and particularly radical feminism, because it's associated with the left, with the Marxist left. And of course, people who take a libertarian view about sex don't admit these things either, because for them, sex can only be regarded as something to be celebrated for the purity of sexual desire. So nobody wants to admit that, in fact, sex is about inequality and people consent for reasons other than their own desire. And this is the problem, I think, at the root of what Alison Saunders, the Director of Public Prosecutions, says about consent. She explains consent by saying it must be beautiful, enthusiasm, mutual. If the other party is less than 100% enthusiastic, then the consent is invalid. It's not consent. Furthermore, she says it is a rape myth to say that consent is any more complicated than that. Okay, and I think that was really worrying. Because, for the reason that, okay, for some people, I admit, sex is like that. It is very easy in certain, let's call them vanilla sexual interactions, to show that consent was enthusiastic, that it was beautiful, that it was mutual, because you can point to something specific that was said or done by both parties. But for many people, sex is not like that. Not because it's forced or deceitfully manipulated, but because the offer-acceptance model is harder to identify, or because we just can't understand why a person might have consented to a particular type of act. Let's say it seems particularly humiliating, or it seems particularly seedy. We look back on what happened and we think, well, she could not possibly have wanted to do that. We don't think that could possibly be consensual, and so we read that back as non-consensual. But consent does not follow the model that we are told it does. It's not the simplistic cup of tea model that the DPP says it is. Let me just give you a few examples of why that is. People often have conflicted feelings when they have sex. So nerves about sex with a new partner, trying out a particular new sexual act for the first time, wanting sex but being fearful of possible consequences like pregnancy, loss of a friendship, discovery by parents or your partner if you're being unfaithful. And secondly, the reasons why, other than pure sexual desire, you might consent, we know that it is very common for people to pretend to want to have sex when in fact they're doing sex in order to achieve something else. They want to gain experience. They want to gain acceptance within a group, promote intimacy within a relationship, to please their partner. For Alison Saunders, because this is not beautiful, it's not enthusiasm, it's not mutual, it's not consent. And I think it's really worrying and it's discriminatory to take that view.
So sex is about inequality. I think that may be something that we come back to. Thank you. That was very interesting. Kathy.
I'm really glad that David brought up that cup of tea video, because I was actually watching that yesterday and thinking, yeah, it's cute, but it really doesn't quite capture the way that the dialogue about consent is currently happening. Because in the video, it's kind of very simple. You say, do you want a cup of tea? If you say yes, then, that's great. If you say no, then that's kind of understood to be a clear no. But what if the conversation went more like this? Well, what if you're offered a cup of tea and you say, well, I'm not really sure. And the other person says, well, oh, no, come on, let's, have a cup of tea. It's really great. And then you sort of say yes because you don't feel like saying no. You don't want to hurt the person's feelings. They, went to the trouble of making tea. And then a week later, you decide that actually that cup of tea was not voluntary and you were pressured into having it. And, then you suddenly accuse them of assault and say that it's really what they did is no different from physically holding you down and pouring a cup of tea down your throat. I mean, I think we would all agree that that's ridiculous, and yet that is pretty much how the conversation about sexual assault and consent is currently proceeding. And you could apply this to really any range of acts that happen in everyday life. What if we suddenly had a huge wave of concern about a hidden epidemic of kidnappings? And we were told that a lot of us really just don't realize when we've been kidnapped because we've been trained to think of kidnapping as a stranger holding a knife or a gun to your throat, and a knife to your throat or a gun to your head, and forcing you into a car and taking you somewhere when you're in fear of your life. And in fact, why aren't we thinking about all those times that you really didn't want to go to a party with your boyfriend or girlfriend, and or you really didn't want to go home with them for Christmas, and you were dragged along, reluctantly because you didn't really have the heart to say no, or maybe you even kind of tried to say no, but you weren't very emphatic about it, and your no wasn't taken very seriously, and you were kind of badgered until you said yes. And, that is pretty much how the conversation is now proceeding. I mean, I have seen these posters that have appeared on college campuses in the US, and I'm sure you have equivalent things here, that say things like, for instance, my favorite line was, if you have to convince them, it's not consent. And I went to the dictionary, and the dictionary actually says, as part of the definition of convince, it's getting someone to consent or agree to something. So, excuse me, but the dictionary really does not agree with this concept. And I mean, that is just a kind of bizarre understanding of the word consent. And it kind of goes a little bit to what David said, that there is this notion that consent has to be this pure sort of entity that is completely uncontaminated by any outside influences other than pure desire. And that not only is that not how sex works, it's really not how anything works in real life. I mean, we all do things that we sometimes do reluctantly, that we go along with because we don't feel like hurting somebody's feelings. If somebody asks you to babysit their child and you don't feel really great about it, but you agree that is not forced labor, it's not equivalent to kidnapping you and forcing you to work for fear of being killed if you refuse. So it's completely unrealistic, not only about sex, which is an extreme, a kind of extraordinarily complicated, fraught area of life, but even with regard to much less emotionally charged activities. So this conversation, to me, just kind of comes across as really detached from reality. And one of the other things in that list of what is and isn't consent, it says if you don't feel free to say no, that's not consent. And that, to me, really kind of invalidates the whole purpose of even the yes means yes campaign, because really, if you can say yes and then at some later point say, well, I didn't really feel free to say no, then what really is the point of even asking for consent? It's meaningless. And, I could actually see in real life situations in which a person could say yes when they were being physically threatened or when they were in a kind of inherently and objectively intimidating situation, and it would not be consent. If somebody is holding a knife to your throat and saying, do you want to have sex, then yeah, you're probably going to say yes when you're not consenting. And I think any reasonable court would find that that is in fact not consent. But when you extend this to situations in which you don't feel free to say no for a variety of other reasons, such as you don't feel like hurting the person's feelings, or you're not assertive enough, in that context, asking for consent is really not going to make any difference. If you don't feel free to say no without being asked, are you really sure you want to do this? Then it's also very possible that if you're asked directly, in fact, it may even increase the pressure in some circumstances. I think some people may feel kind of more comfortable rebuffing an indirect advance than directly, saying no to a verbal overture. So I think this yes means yes proposal that is now very popular really is kind of meaningless. And I think we really have to get back to, I think David is quite right, not all sex is great and wonderful and pure. And I think we should be able to acknowledge that there are experiences that, maybe have some ethical problems with them, but are not necessarily illegal or, non-consensual in the sense of being rape.
So why should sex be different? We've probably all babysat when we didn't want to, I know I have. Straight on to Matthew. Thank you, Kathy.
Well, I think I come at this as a lawyer, and I've asked myself, well, what is wrong with our law on consent? And I'm sorry if it's not very controversial, but I don't actually think there is a great deal wrong with our law on consent. The law is quite well defined by statute now. It used to be very much left up entirely to what the jury thought, but since 2003 it's been more closely defined. And what it says is a person consents if he, usually a she in fact, but the law says he, if he agrees by choice and has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. Now, I don't see anything wrong with that. Clearly, if somebody is not free to make a choice or doesn't have the capacity to make the choice because, for example, they're too drunk to understand what's going on, they're not properly consenting. So I think the law is actually quite well defined. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't problems, and there are problems, certainly around the edges. I think there is a problem with our current DPP and her seeming obsession with what she defines as rape myths. I hadn't heard what David mentioned. This was a bit of a surprise to me that she's apparently saying if you're less than 100% enthusiastic, then that means you're not consenting. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, David, but if she did say that, then, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. And that would mean that probably most of us are guilty of rape and having been raped at some point in our lives, if not quite regularly. Anyway, there are problems around the edges. The question of deception is one which, in the law, it sends my head spinning. The law is quite clear about one form of deception which does vitiate consent, and that's if you pretend to be somebody's girlfriend or boyfriend, more likely boyfriend, in order to have sex, or somebody personally known to the complainant. Then there's an irrebuttable presumption that is rape. In other circumstances, though, it's much less clear, and there are cases going both ways where somebody pretends to be somebody else in order to persuade somebody else to perform a sexual act, whether it's intercourse or something else. And I'm afraid there's not a great deal of consistency in the cases there, and don't ask me to say what the law is, because I don't really know. A very contentious area, of course, is children and teenagers. And here again, I don't actually think there is a huge amount wrong with the law. I don't think it's outrageous to suggest that the age of consent should be 15 or even 14 or 17. But we've got 16. It's been 16 for a long time. There's a lot to be said for a clear law where everybody knows where they stand. And I don't see any particularly pressing need to change that. I think where the difficulty arises is with children or teenagers having sex with each other and then being prosecuted, because that seems to me very often a huge overreaction. And we've heard recently of some of these cases of children sexting each other. My children tell me they don't do it. But they tell me that lots of their friends do. And I can well believe it. And if they get caught, then of course they will be certainly in possession of indecent child sexual images, and if they've sent them to somebody else, then of distributing them. And they are incredibly serious offences which will result in them probably never really being entirely expunged from their criminal records, and that is a problem, and that's in my view quite ridiculous. But whether the answer to that is to tinker with the law, or whether the answer to that is to have a more sensible prosecution policy, I'm not sure. I think quite often there is a lot to be said for a clear law that everybody understands, mitigated by sensible prosecution policies. But perhaps that doesn't always happen. So that's something which I think is a legitimate subject for conversation. Speaking as a barrister with practice in these cases, rape cases and sex cases where consent is an issue, it is true, of course, that very often it's one person's word against another. Usually there's some sort of backup, but very often that amounts to simply, well, the complainant told somebody else shortly after the event that they'd been raped or sexually assaulted. And it is very difficult for the prosecution to prove guilt in those cases, and very often they don't succeed when there's no corroboration. And that seems to me that the law is working quite well. I see a much bigger problem with historic cases, where I think the law has been changed and manipulated in order to, manipulate is perhaps not quite the right word, but it's been changed and it's been made easier to bring historic sexual prosecutions, and proving lack of consent in something which happened a few weeks or months ago is one thing. Proving it in cases years old is quite another, and I think there's a real problem. But whether that is because of the law of consent or for other reasons, I think is a moot point.
Wow, bang on time. You said you weren't going to be controversial, but actually saying the law is kind of okay in this area is might prove controversial in some quarters. Yeah. Well, it might do in some, maybe not, we'll see, but definitely in some quarters. And straight on to Luke.
Thanks. I started writing about this topic some time ago, and I realised very quickly that the state of the debate is pretty dire, because I think really what has happened is we've become fixated on sex, and I don't really want to talk about sex, because I think that the topic that we really should be talking about is intimacy. And intimacy is not the same as sex. Sex is not the same as intimacy. But I think we face a real problem in contemporary society about defining what it is about intimacy and intimacy between human beings, which is important. So I think that really these debates around consent and around rape are really hinting at a broader discussion. So I think my starting point is to say, why is it that we have to ask the question in contemporary society, what is consent? Because most of the time when I speak to people, they say, well, consent is consent. You agree with another person to do something. It's not rocket science. It's very straightforward. And I think there's a heavy dose of common sense out there in the public about what consent is. But I think there is a sense of anxiety and confusion amongst certain sections of society about people negotiating that for themselves. So I started looking at this topic and asking, what is intimacy? What is an intimate relationship? And I started from the position of reading around this topic and thinking, what is it about human interactions which make them intimate? And I think what makes an interaction intimate is if, to some degree, it is negotiated outside of the rules which govern wider society. So it's a relationship which exists in its own particular dynamic, something which is not necessarily fitting directly with laws, not something which is directly comparable to other areas of life. And I think that that's an extremely important dimension of human experience. The idea that you can interact with someone free from the expectations which govern wider society, I think is extremely important. And that's why I think it's problematic to talk about intimacy merely in the context of rape, because obviously rape has nothing to do with intimacy. Rape is an act of violence, and what I think has happened today, and one area which I think the law is responsible for causing some harm, is conflating bad sex and rape. And I think that's extremely problematic, because what it does is that it takes the intimate sphere, the sphere in which people negotiate relationships for themselves, and it opens it up to a significant degree of public scrutiny. So we've seen this trend in not just the opening up of intimate relationships to public regulation, I think has become extremely problematic, most obviously with respect to young people, actually. So as part of my research for this talk, I Googled young people intimate relationships. I promise it was part of my research. But what happened, but it was interesting because the first 10 pages are reports about how potentially dangerous intimacy is for young people. It's reports about how emotional violence can be inherent in all teen relationships. It's about the government's redefinition of domestic violence to include emotional violence, which occurred 2 years ago, or 4 years ago now, I think. It's about sexting. It's about the problems with with young people closing their relationships off from the adult world. And I think if we continually tell young people that intimacy is something to be scared of, then it's almost inevitable that they're going to end up sending rude pictures of each other to one another. Because what else do you do? To actually close yourself off and have a private relationship with another human being is presented to them as something which is inherently dangerous. And that's why when you have, it's not just these 10 pages of reports around intimacy, but the emergence of consent onto the PSHE curriculum. The idea that we should, the first thing we teach our young people about intimacy is making sure that you avoid a rape allegation or an allegation of sexual assault. That really is the first thing we are telling young people about sex and intimacy now, that it's dangerous. But the key thing is to not get fixated on sex, because all kinds of intimate relationships have been interfered with and opened up in the same way that sexual relationships have. So, for example, we'll be speaking later, there's another session in today's, or later in the festival, around parenting and breastfeeding. And I think that it's important to see the discussion around consent in the context of a broader pattern of opening private relationships up to public scrutiny and judgment. Okay, to sum up then, so I think the key thing here is to not think about consent solely in the context of sex, but to think about a discussion around consent in the context of our discussion around intimacy. Is there a sphere of human interaction which needs to be shielded to some degree from public regulation? And so I think that the danger with the law we have at the moment, and the danger with current legal developments and current legal trends, is that we've seen the space for people's private relationships, relationships which occur completely in private. We've seen gradually the law closing in around people's ability to form those relationships. And that's what I'm concerned with, not so much about, I think when it comes to rape and consent, really that's the tip of the iceberg of a broader problem around intimacy and the regulation of intimacy. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you. And thanks very much to the speakers for keeping to time. And Luke's obviously broadened things out to say the issue isn't just about sex. I have got so many questions I want to ask the panel, but I'm going to sit on my hands and throw things straight out to you.
First to David, who talked about dominance, and you're quite factually wrong on this. I researched the review papers on the biological roots of human sociality. Dominance, right, there's no such thing as a dominance interaction between sexes. It's what's happened throughout biology in lots of species, and ours not excluded, is that dominance signalling has been co-opted for courtship purposes. So when a male in that situation is exhibiting, he's not being dominant to the female partner, he's actually signalling his dominance. Dominance being a key part of male mate value, and obviously it's part of the whole courtship interaction, right? That's the first thing. So the feminists have got it 100% wrong on this, and this is key to why rape has been politicised. So I think that's a really important point. Second point, which to what Matthew talked about age of consent. You said there's no problem about age of consent being 40, 50. The point is, the age of consent of 16 came in, over a century ago, when the average age of female puberty was 17. right? Now the average age of female puberty is, 10? Yet the age of consent is still 16. Clearly there's something deeply problematic about that. And anyone who can't recognise that really is in a very strange land.
I wanted to pick up on what Kathy said about sometimes things may be ethically problematic, but are they rape? And is that a problem that is happening now, in that people don't seem to be able to have a moral framework and be able to put things within a moral contextualisation and do look to laws and external agencies and regulators to explain and understand and govern that situation. And perhaps the historic abuse seems to be an example of that, in which you can't now say, well, this person is a sleazebag and it is really wrong what they've done, but is it something to go into the court of law? And is that, and I'm just interested in what the panel think, why this intensity around university and young people do seem to be more and more calling, can we have external authorities to tell us exactly how to manage our intimate relationships? Is this because they have less of a grasp of being morally autonomous human beings now, or a framework in which they can understand their experiences apart from external agencies telling them what their experiences, how their experiences must be interpreted?
Thank you. In a book that was published this year, that was reviewed on Spike, called Freedom Fallacy, I believe was the title, by Joanna Williams, who reviewed it, there was an interesting, it was a book by second wave feminists, and it was attacking the whole idea of liberal feminists and sort of dismissing them as for the idea of choice. As far as they all seem to be concerned that women have no choice, and liberal feminists who say that women have choice, they would sort of dismissing as an outrage. And I wondered what you feel about this sort of idea that women just cannot choose, or they cannot say no. I mean, I know it's already slightly been referred to, but it just seemed to be come back in force within some parts of radical feminism.
Thank you. I was just wondering, what is the extent someone give a free consent to self-destructive behavior? Because I don't know if there is a possibility to draw a line by law for that. I mean, I understand someone cannot just by law give away life, but to health and to the integrity of their own body, to where can you pull a line? And the other thought, I think, law and moral, they are in a sort of downgoing spiral, and when law closes in, it's normally because there's a lack of moral in a society there. And it's kind of a vicious circle, because as soon as law closes in, the moral goes even lower. So I don't know if there's any sort of method to turn that around, which is maybe education.
This is really sort of a two-part question to do more with some of the intricacies around the law regarding rape. The first of which, clearly I'm speaking to multiple barristers here, so if I'm wrong about this, you'll be the first to know. But I was wondering, firstly, as I understand it, the law in the UK is such that only men are able to be convicted of rape. So I was wondering if this is the case, is this perhaps time for a change, as such that both men and women and non-binary people would be able to be convicted of rape? And therefore, is it perhaps the case that this sort of viewpoint comes down to an unsavoury perspective from the past of men being intrinsically dominant in sexual relations? And the second point is that it's been discussed a couple of times about the idea of consent coming down largely to people understanding the sort of the physical sort of potential responses to sex, so for example pregnancy and so on. So I was just curious as to how this could relate to people who have so two or more people, for example, who have a mental handicap, to the extent that we can't really say that they fully understand the potential for things like STIs and pregnancy and so on, or perhaps to the full extent that we would hope a standard consenting group would be able to.
Well, I just wanted to address, because I didn't really have time to go into that, but yeah, I think that this issue that was brought up by someone in the audience about the morality versus law, and how do we separate not just bad sex in terms of it not being very satisfying, but bad sex which may involve certain unethical behaviors. Where do we draw the line between that and actual rape or sexual assault? And I think that is a very important question because, again, with sexual acts, as with everything else, there are things people may do involving, for instance, emotional coercion, including, involving pressuring someone into doing something that they don't want to do. That is not illegal, but at the same time may very well be morally questionable, and perhaps especially in the area of intimacy where, these acts may be far more emotionally charged than say, getting someone to go to a movie with you. I mean, sex really is a more intimate act. So, understandably, there is a kind of high level of kind of tension, and it is more problematic. And I think the fact that we have really gotten away from this moral and ethical framework to one that uses terms like rape, because once you start using language like consent and rape, sexual assault, if you use them in an extra legal sense, you're really trivializing in a way the concept of rape. Because I think it's perfectly fine to say, it's a bad thing to pressure someone into having sex with you when they're sort of really not that keen on it. But to say that it's non-consensual sort of immediately moves it from an ethical framework into what should be a legal one, at least. There was this bizarre story the other day that you all probably saw about the woman at Oxford, the student activist, who resigned from her position in student government after making an admission that she had realized she had engaged in non-consensual sex with somebody who, approached her weeks after the sexual experience and said, that was non-consensual. And she had apparently failed to check consistently every step of the way that, her partner was consenting. Now, it's entirely possible, I wasn't there, I don't know what actually went on. It's entirely possible that this person felt pressured into having unwanted sex. And I think it should be entirely possible to approach someone and say, just for the record, I really felt pressured by you, I really wasn't that keen on it, and, you really shouldn't do that. And I think people should be able to negotiate that. I think maybe even in universities, I think, if people don't feel like they don't feel comfortable just initiating that conversation on their own, it should probably be possible for counselors to enable people to have that conversation without completely assigning blame to one person, because if one person is responsible for kind of pressuring another, I think we also should be able to say that yes, this is a bad experience, but you should also learn more assertiveness skills to speak up. So so I think we should be able to discuss those issues without turning everything into issues of consent and rape.
So we need to have that clear line between morally dubious behaviour and the law. Luke, I see you want to speak, and then we'll come to David.
There was a very interesting question in the audience about the extent to which people can consent to violence. I think that's a key question, because there's a series of cases in the 1970s and 80s where this was explored in the courts in the UK around homosexual men engaging in BDSM and the extent to which they should be permitted to inflict quite serious violence on one another without committing a criminal offence. So there's a case in the Court of Appeal in England where a group of men had basically been torturing one another and filming it and sharing the videos among themselves, not distributing them any wider. And the police raided their house, found these videos, and charged them all with grievous bodily harm on each other. None of them had made any complaint to the police, none of them had gone to the authorities, but they'd found evidence on these videos that they had been inflicting injuries on each other. The reason why this case was interesting was that you then have judges in the UK attempting, and it's a wonderful judgment if you read it, because the judges are basically saying, well, these people should be able to get on with whatever they want in their private lives, but there's a line to draw where society has to intervene. And I think that's a key question. Where does the line between the law and public regulation and the interests of society interact with people's right to negotiate their intimate relationships for themselves? My own argument is that it's important to push that line back as far as possible, because I think it becomes very dangerous when the courts seek to establish a standard for intimate relationships. And I think that the defendants in that case had a very strong argument to say, really, if we are all consenting individuals, the law has no role in intervening to prevent us from engaging in this activity. You've seen that discussion come up again, actually, in the context of contemporary people wanting to engage in BDSM and all sorts of things. And they're actually facing quite a tough time because they're not sure exactly what they are allowed and not allowed to do. The law is not entirely clear, but the authorities have quite a broad scope to intervene in what should be a fundamentally private act. And I think that's, and so for example, one lawyer who's particularly involved in this area, a guy called Miles Jackman, who's also a writer, he's now calling for a sexual relations act to basically enshrine the rights of certain people with fringe sexualities in law. My own view is that's just going to make it worse, because if you happen to fall outside whatever the state decides is a legitimate fringe sexuality, then you're facing the same problem.
So we've got some measure of agreement on the panel that the law should stay back and not concern itself necessarily with morally dubious behaviour. When I come back out to the audience, I'll be particularly interested to hear from people who don't agree with that and who think maybe the law should be more active. But before I do that, David, feel free to comment on any of this, not all of this, but any of this. But there were a couple of questions around this issue of the eroticisation of inequality, which I found very interesting in your comments.
Absolutely. Well, I just wanted to speak to because there was two comments about dominance feminism or second wave feminism. The gentleman down at the front, as far as I understand it, you were making an argument from a biological perspective. But the biological way of looking at this has got nothing to do with second wave feminism or dominance feminism whatsoever. Dominance feminism is about culture. It's about what people find sexy or what they are... how their desire is structured in society, how our culture makes us want certain things and certain people and not want other things. I'm saying that inequality is sexy for certain people, and we know this because, for example, the sorts of role-playing that people might do with their partners or people online or together involve certain scenarios involving inequality. The office romance, for example, the doctor-patient relationship. These are sort of fantasies of inequality. We know that pornography as well is dominated by that kind of script. So it's not about biology. So we can agree, I think, that biologically there's no basis on this. The second point about gentlemen talking about second-wave feminism, it is true, second-wave feminists, the dominance feminists, do say that a woman's choice to have sex is not a real choice, because sex is an enactment of inequality in society. It's simply enacting the inequalities that women suffer. I suggest that we can reject that. We don't have to follow the dominance feminists to their conclusions. What I'm saying is that they make certain observations from which we can draw other conclusions. So they make a correct point at the beginning that I have said that people eroticize domination or inequality. But that doesn't mean that consent is invalid in heterosexual sex or heterosexual relationships. That's not where I'm going with that at all. I mean that because of that, people deliberately transgress this offer acceptance model of sex because they find that sexy. They don't want to have conversations about, do you consent? Yes, I consent. That is not sexy. We know that. We've all agreed on that. And that's why I'm insisting on this insight as a cultural insight that the dominance feminists brought us. And I think that's correct.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's kind of a problem, though, but if we do eroticise inequality, but that's something
That's a different point.
That's a different point, yes. Matthew, you had some specific questions on the law.
Well, there's one specific question on the law from the gentleman over there who said, is it only men that can be convicted of rape? No, it isn't, actually. You can be convicted of rape as a woman, although the law says that rape is penetration by the penis. And so you say, well, how can a woman penetrate someone with a penis? Well, the answer is she can't do it herself, but if she helps or encourages a man to do it, then she can be convicted. There have been cases. I think a statistic at the back of my mind says something like 0.1% of rape people convicted of rape were women. So it's not very many, but it can happen. The gentleman down here, with his very biological view of dominant men and children growing up earlier, and so on. And I think your point, sir, is that because children now come to puberty earlier, then that means we should lower the age of consent. Is that it in a nutshell?
That's the point, yeah.
Well, I'm afraid I don't agree with that at all. And historically, you've taken a very short view, because you say, well, we've had the age of consent now at 16 for, I'm not quite sure how many years, but I think 2 figures rather than 3, it's been 16. Before that, it was 14. Presumably at a time when the age of puberty was even later. And before that, I don't think there was any age of consent at all. And I'm afraid to set the age of consent based upon puberty leads ultimately to the sort of revolting situation we have in the Islamic State, where any girl who is having periods and is sexually mature is then considered fair game. And I'm afraid your biological approach to setting the age of consent is not the right one, in my view. I think we need to have clear lines, although obviously one has to recognise that many children are not going to necessarily obey them. And that brings us on to the lady here who was talking about banning self-destructive behaviour and how far does the law do that. And it's a bit inconsistent, really. We ban dangerous drugs, some dangerous drugs. We allow other dangerous drugs. We allow suicide now, although we didn't in the past. But one thing which is consistent is that we try and protect children. So we don't let children, I think the age for buying alcohol is certainly 18. I think it's now 18 for tobacco as well. I look at the age of consent as a similar sort of approach to that. It's banning children from self-destructive behaviour. If adults want to indulge in risky sexual practices, which may well be self-destructive, well, that's up to them. But with children, I think we should have a clear line, and 16 seems to me as good an age as any other.
So very clear response there, very clear disagreement. Barbara, are you happy at the moment, or would you like to say something? And then I will go back out.
There were 2 things I wanted to say. I mean, one was someone raised the really important issue about what you do in the situation of people with learning disabilities. And that's a very vexed question, particularly amongst social services departments, where they may have young adults or indeed relatively mature adults who have relatively impaired mental capacity, but who nonetheless form relationships with other adults. And sometimes a view is taken that, yes, they've got sufficient understanding and it's not appropriate for the authorities to interfere. Where it can get very problematic, though, is if one of the learning disabled adults then becomes pregnant and has a baby, because then you get into all sorts of issues about whether they can parent the baby, and if they can't, then what should be done. And you do see some fairly upsetting instances of people who repeatedly have babies and are in no way able to care for them, and social services just keep on taking the babies away. So that's a worrying situation. And there's no clear line there, you see. All the capacity assessments are done on a kind of individualised basis. So there isn't, unlike the age of consent, you could say there's a clear age below which the law doesn't contemplate or tolerate the idea of sexual activity. Once you are of 18, it all becomes an assessment of just what your mental impairment is and whether it's right to allow you to engage in sexual activity. I think the other thing I wanted to talk about in the context of why are we having this anxiety about intimacy and sexual relations, and I think that the point about the distinction between morality and legality is a very important one, and something that Luke hasn't touched on yet, but I'm sure he will want to, because I think it's in his book, is this idea that one of the reasons why we have this anxiety is this lack of resilience, that people nowadays, if they have a sexual encounter and they go away and they feel unhappy about it, they feel exploited, they feel pressured, their reaction to it is to think, oh, well, I must be the victim of a legal wrong here and I must go to an external authority figure, instead of saying, well, that was a shitty experience and he was a creep, but I'm not going to let it ruin my life. I'm just going to learn from it and move on, which is a more old-fashioned kind of way of looking at it. And I do think the case that Luke discusses in his book about Ched Evans, the footballer whose appeal is coming up, is a very interesting example of a situation where not many people know this, but the reason why the woman went to the police was not to report a rape, but to report that she'd lost her handbag because she'd lost it on the night out. And obviously she wanted to get home, she wanted to get her purse, her keys and so on. So she went in to report a lost item of property and came out labelled as a rape victim. And I think that's interesting about how her experience was then interpreted by others, and she was then reframed as a victim of the most heinous crime instead of as a person who was going to report something that was, in the overall scheme of things, a lost item of property, very important.
We've lost our resilience. Okay, I'm going to come back out. I'm going to go to the back, although it's had lots of hands, and as I say, if you disagree, that would be good to hear.
Yeah, so I'd like to add a different angle to this debate. We started off with a line, we all agree that no means no. And what I think is very interesting is this debate is actually called Blurred Lines. And with songs like that, with phrases like, you know you want it, and chants in American colleges saying stuff like, no means yes, yes means anal. Should we really start with premises like that? Chants like that, the rallies that had those chants were some of the biggest in these colleges, and they were at colleges like Harvard, like hugely intellectual, hugely popular colleges. Surely dealing with issues like that, and dealing with the fact that actually consent is viewed as very different by certain people among my gender, is a far bigger issue than, talking about kind of pedantic points about the nature of sex and whether gay BDSM porn is, bad or good. Like, some of this stuff seems a little superficial compared to the real problem that we're having. Bear in mind, we're in a society where, sexually related crimes are unbelievably prosecutions for sexually related crimes are unbelievably under-enforced. Surely dealing with these kind of issues and the fact that people don't really agree to the normal version of consent is far more important than actually dealing with some of the issues that have been talked about so far.
Sorry, just a couple of questions. I think the panel have outlined superbly well why there are so many problems with the notion of consent, particularly as it's being posed towards children in schools and students in universities. And it seems to me that, again, as people have really outlined, there's quite an impossible standard being put before young people as to what consent actually means. And I'm quite naive about these things, but I actually imagine there must be quite a disjuncture between what people are being taught in the classroom and what actually does happen in practice. And I'm just wondering how that can actually play itself out in reality, how far this can continue, this disjuncture which must inevitably, it seems to me, be there. That's my first question. My second question, just briefly, is people have been negotiating sexual relationships since humanity first began on Earth. Why is there this obsession about consent now? And it does seem to be a complete obsession. It seems to be everywhere at the moment. So where has this come from? If I was to answer that question, I would very much go along with what Luke was saying, and I think he made some really important points about the crisis of intimacy. And I would personally trace that back to the beginning of the 1980s, when you had a collapse of working class politics, really, with things like the miners' strike going on at the same time as the child sexual abuse scandal in Cleveland really opened up intervention in the family life. But it seems to me that you create this vicious cycle then where the more intervention takes place in the family life, the more you have a crisis of intimacy, and the whole thing just goes completely circular. So can there ever be an end to this?
Just really quickly in response to what was said just there, if anybody says or sings anything that you think is offensive, it's not for the law. You can go and sing something back or choose not to listen to the song. So that's that point cleared up. I think what we need to reiterate is that, and what's been said is that sex is an adult act, it's an adult concept, and so therefore to be an adult means that you make your own decisions, you stand up for yourself as far as you can, and this is where the law steps in for rape and sexual assault when you cannot defend yourself. But I'm just interested to try and pick out this idea of unethical behaviour or bad behaviour. And I think that the onus there is on the individual or the individual and a group of friends to sort that situation out. If you have a bad night and the guy doesn't call you back or is a creep, the onus there is on you to voice your opinion of, to say that you didn't enjoy it. It's not for you to then go to the law. So I think I just want to pick out how that is in relation to an idea of victimhood, because you do have situations now in which, especially in universities, consent classes and the like are telling young women who have had sexual encounters that they were actually mistaken and that they didn't realise at the time that they were raped. And so how can then something that was bad behaviour become rape? Just want to pick that out.
I'm going to come back to the panel for really brief comments that you just can't hold in, and then I'm going to try to go back out to the audience for at least one more round, and then bear in mind that you will have a chance to sum up at the end. So I know, Kathy, you were very patient before. You had a point you wanted to make? Or
Yeah, well, I just wanted to really quickly address the question that the gentleman brought up about, is there really respect for the notion that no means no when we have, there was a mention of the line, I know you want it, from the Blurred Lines song, and these fraternity events on some American campuses with people chanting, no means yes, yes means anal. Okay, so first of all, I really don't think, to interpret the line, I know you want it, as, especially the way that it's sung in this sort of flirty, seductive way, as somehow overriding a no, is just really kind of mind-boggling to me. And honestly, I've written about the Blurred Lines controversy. People have pointed out that there are examples of songs sung by women, in a woman's voice, essentially, saying the same thing to a man. So, that is just a kind of bizarre interpretation to me. In terms of those fraternity chants, I think I have to realize that the whole point of these exercises is to do something really outrageous and something that goes against kind of the prevailing, moral code or the prevailing convention. So I think that, to me, actually demonstrates that there is a very strongly held assumption that they're defying a social norm. That's the whole point. So, I think that actually demonstrates the opposite of,
that's an interesting point. Yeah, that we have to allow people to transgress. Luke, very briefly, please.
Very briefly, thank you for the question at the back, because I think it's important. I think no means no is the perfect starting point, really, for consent. That is a basic truth, which is a good point of departure. And I think the more we move away from that, the worse we get. But I think I want to say a bit about resilience. And the reason I was interested in Ched Evans' case was not really the substantive case itself, but more the reaction to it. And I'm not going to talk about that now either, but just to say that the case itself is a very difficult one, and obviously it's recently been referred back to the Court of Appeal. But I thought the reaction to the case was very interesting, but that was probably going to be talked about at another occasion. What I do want to talk about is the idea of resilience, because I think in the course of second wave feminism, which we've heard a little bit about, the act of coming forward with a rape complaint was actually quite significant, because in the 1970s and 80s, second wave feminists made the correct point that women were genuinely prevented in all sorts of ways from coming forward with rape complaints. So they did legitimately, I think, valorize the process of making a complaint in the first place, because it took a degree of coming out of the darkness, as it were, into and facing up to quite a difficult social situation. Today, we still valorize the process of making a complaint, but at the expense, I think, of individual judgment. So the act of making a complaint has almost become political and politicized. I think that's problematic in a way which the second wave feminists perhaps share some blame for, but which was understandable at the time because the conditions were so different. Now I think we need, in talking about how to move on from this situation, we need to sort of say that it's okay to feel bad about what happens in an intimate setting. And that's actually quite a big thing to say to, I think, especially young people today, to sort of say, look, this is a risky process. It might feel bad sometimes, and you might come away from it feeling bad, but that is sort of goes with the territory. I think it falls on us as adults who have been through, I'm sure, many of the similar situations, to say that it's okay to feel that way, and it sort of goes with the territory. If there's any chance of educating young people about intimacy properly, that's the starting point, I think.
So we've got to toughen up a bit. David, very briefly, please.
Okay, very briefly. On the first point, I think we can't really proceed on the assumption that all of these formulas are equal. No means no is a fairly uncontroversial thing to say about consent, but no means yes and yes means anal is as Kathy said, is designed to be provocative. So I don't think it's very helpful to say that we're just descending into the same kind of sloganism when we say no means no. On the second question, can there ever be an end to this apparent obsession? Well, I would say no, there can't really be an end, and it's probably best that there isn't an end to it, for the reason that I gave, which is that people deliberately seek out sexual fulfillment in ways that challenge our very simplistic ideas of consent, because they find it fulfilling, they find it a turn on. And number three, I don't think we're talking here necessarily about bad behavior. If something happens to you that you don't feel satisfied about, then that's obviously something for you and your friends. But when we're talking about rape, we're talking about something going beyond exploring the uncertainties or the certainties about what you actually want from a sexual encounter. We're talking about, as the law puts it, freedom and capacity to consent. So I think we need to keep that in the frame. It's not just obsession about, something bad happened and I'll go to the police. I think that's too reductive, I think.
Yes, well, I was going to deal with the gentleman up there very briefly. I'm sure everyone wants me to be very brief. His sort of rather throwaway line, we all know that sexual offences are very under-prosecuted, and far more sexual offences take place than are ever prosecuted. Well, actually, we don't all know that. The statistics on this are extremely hard to gather, and when they are gathered, they're often extremely unreliable, and they tend to do things like equating an unwanted kiss or a sort of squeezing up somebody on the tube train or something relatively minor like that with sexual offending or rape, and they get terribly confused. And I'm afraid it's not fair to make that assumption. And in fact, and it's just anecdote, but my experience, and I think probably the experience of most criminal barristers, is that a great many cases are brought to court where the chances of conviction are actually quite small, and they're pursued by the CPS because in many cases the CPS is actually afraid to drop them. And so you have the rather unhappy position of a man being put through, usually a man, being put through a rape trial or a sexual assault trial of some sort, a woman being given false hope. I say a woman, of course it could be a man as well, but a victim or a complainant being given false hope, and then when it ends in acquittal, well, nobody is really gained by that. So whether there are too many cases prosecuted or not enough, I really don't know. But I don't think the lazy assumption, if I can be rather rude to you, sir, that everybody knows too few rape cases or sex cases are prosecuted is one that should be easily made.
So they're sticking to there's too much law, not too little. Or Barbara, just very briefly, because I would like to get some more.
Sure. Well, I mean, not many people know this, but 40% of cases going through the criminal courts are about sex offences. So it's not the case that sex offences are under-prosecuted. If anything, they're over-prosecuted, as Matthew was suggesting.
That's very interesting. I did not know that.
Isn't it worth asking, what is it about some human behaviours that means they are criminalised? Why is it that we as a society reserve the right to send some people to prison because of the way they behave? Now, when it comes to rape, it seems to me the criminal essence of the matter is what's going on in the man's head. Sorry, that didn't really work very well. But that's the point about rape. It always used to be the case, and it should be the case, that a man is guilty of rape if he knows the woman is not consenting, or he couldn't give a damn about whether or not the woman is consenting. That's really the essence of the matter. Now, that was all changed under the Act of 2003, which now means that the jury doesn't have to ask itself what's going on in the man's head. The jury can say, well, Mr. Defendant, we don't give a damn about the fact that you genuinely believe the woman was consenting. We, the jury, find that your belief was not a reasonable belief. And that means you're no longer criminalising people for what's going on in the man's head. You are judging them by the standards of 12 jurors. And that means you bring into play all their own particular moral standpoints, their own personal views about proper conduct, about respect for women, and so on and so forth. That is not a way in which to criminalise behaviour. And Matthew, Alison Saunders did say this. You'll find it in The Guardian, 25th of September. She did say, to her, consent has to be enthusiastic and beautiful. She's entitled to those views because that is now what the law enables jurors to ask themselves, if they so choose. And the way to deal with that problem is to criticise the law. Not as you said, Matthew, that the law is all right. The problem really is fundamentally with the law. And it means that if the jury was always comprised of 12 Alison Saunders, most men would spend all their lives in prison. Because as soon as they came out of prison, they'd soon get locked up again. So the law, the boundary has been set far too low, and we need to re-establish the limited ambit of the criminal law in this regard by criminalising what's going wrong in the man's head.
Hello. We've talked a lot about children and young people. I'm actually a head of sixth form and have been a head of sixth form for a very long time. And it is very noticeable that I have had to deal, sadly, with the fallout of cases of students who've got themselves into sexual encounters and then question themselves afterwards. And whilst I would agree that it is very sad that suddenly we're having to think about addressing this idea of consent, I do feel that it is important that we do. And we've talked a lot about pressure here. We've also, a gentleman at the back brought up the idea of the song Blurred Lines. And the lady said that we can turn that song off. Well, we can turn that song off. But the problem with young people, of course, is this is the message that they're getting all the time. And I'm not sure whether it's pressure rather, or just confusion, because it's about their perceived expectations of what society wants of them. And I think there's an issue about pornography and what these young people are seeing and what young men are seeing as being normal in pornography and what young women are thinking is what is expected of them. So I think it's a question of the fact that we need to redress that balance in PHSEE lessons and at university, because perhaps it's about young girls not understanding that they can say no and what is expected of them because they're so worried about conforming to the norms of society.
I'm not so sure that the issue of consent is that relevant when you consider the 1,400 ignored in Rotherham because they were a bad type of person, apparently, or Jimmy Savile's 1,000 victims. I think that a lot of it has to do with status. Various barristers and judges are probably not aware that they're only getting a limited number of the huge amount that are ignored by the police. And as I said, it has to do with status, and that's probably the reason why you don't realise, and you're keen to call it a witch hunt, and turn the tables on what the CSA inquiry is doing by saying, let's ignore historic cases. Well, historic cases probably were too afraid to go to the police in the past because they realised that there would be some sort of status discrimination. And what are we doing now? We're denying them that because you want to get rid of some of the numbers that you've got piling up. I think consent is something that is status orientated, and people have been given a bad name and told their testimony isn't worth anything, and that's takes away the whole issue of consent and the meaning of it.
I'll be very brief, and panel, I don't need a reply on this, but I want to raise a rebuttal to what we've heard earlier about lowering the age of consent due to the age of puberty. And with respect, this method of doing ethics was solved by Hume in the 18th century in his naturalistic fallacy. We cannot draw moral statements from statements about nature. They're two different kinds of statements. If I give you 100 statements about carrots, you can't conclude any conclusions about peas. It's different kinds of statements. Like the fact that we have canine teeth is not and never can be a reason why it's morally permissible to eat meat. Now, it might be morally permissible to eat meat and it might not, but you can't use that we've got canine teeth for it. So you can't use, I'm afraid, the fact that the age of puberty has changed, may well be a fact, but it is not a moral statement, it's a natural statement. And whatever the moral statement is about the age of puberty, about the age of consent, it's a different kind of statement and we need a different kind of source for it.
I'm going to come back to the panel now for their concluding remarks. It really is a matter of just one or two sentences. You have about 1.5 minutes each, so just very, very brief final comments, please.
Wow. Well, I thought I'd try and tease out the implications of the lady who spoke just now about status and consent. And I think, one of the things I found frustrating about the discussion of status is that, you like to think that society has evolved to some extent and that we are a more equal society than we were historically compared to, say, Victorian times, Elizabethan times, feudal times, when there were very hierarchical social structures. And I guess the problem about status is that it can mean different things to different people. And my concern, my uneasiness about it is that it seems to be a variant of the argument that certain types of feminism have advanced, which is that you can never consent if you're a female and the other party to the transaction is a male. So I think, I entirely agree, and this is where I think the morality is very important, because there are all sorts of relationships, say student and teacher at universities, where there's an imbalance of power, where you can say, yes, ethically it's completely unacceptable that the more powerful party should use their position to gain entry into various sexual relationships. But I think there's a risk of being too reductive about it. And this is where I also feel the argument about blurred lines is interesting, because there's a demand almost for certainty, but at the expense of other things. Now, that's a very kind of abbreviated response, and it's really, I hope, the start of a conversation rather than the end of it. But
and yet,
that's my thought.
Some very beautiful relationships started as student-teacher
Absolutely.
relationships. David.
Sure, thanks. Well, I'll just say thank you very much to the gentleman halfway back who confirmed what I said about Alison Saunders, the Director of Public Prosecutions, that she did actually say what I said she said. She has added to the legal requirement for consent in her remarks, which I think is deeply worrying, because it means that she herself, the one person who you should be able to rely on to understand consent, misunderstands consent. I think that completely proves why we're all here today and justifies that. And the lady who made the point about children in schools and pornography, I think that is quite right. Pornography does pressurize young people to conform to a certain picture of desire. I think it also underlines the thing I was trying to say about desire being culturally constructed. Pornography is a very important part of our culture in the sense that it, well, helped, in inverted commas, us to understand what is sexy. Obviously, it misleads us in certain ways, and it makes us think that domination is something to be cherished, when in fact it can be something very dangerous. And finally, the chap at the end, I completely agree, facts and norms, they're completely separate, and I don't think you could draw one from the other. And you made a very important point too, but I think that's also been covered by Barbara.
Thank you. I'm really worried about this eroticisation of inequality, but we can talk about that in further sessions. Cathy?
Yeah, a couple of quick points. First of all, we've been discussing the idea that yes means yes is kind of a problematic standard, and no means no should really be sort of the golden rule that we should kind of stick to. I would say that no means no is really not quite as clear-cut as it seems, because, for instance, I think there are situations in which a person doesn't say no, but there is clearly no consent. If you wake up in bed in the middle of the night with a stranger, coming through the window and climbing into your bed, you may be too terrified to say no or to say anything or to, even do anything physical to convey non-consent. But nonetheless, I think most people would agree that it's a non-consensual situation. At the same time, what does no means no actually mean? If you say no and then the person tries again 10 minutes later, there are people who would argue that, in fact, even if at that point you go along with it, that should be considered rape, because, no means no should mean that all advances should cease at that point. So I think we really should be more kind of clear-cut about what do we mean by no means no. And I would argue that the real standard, probably, in my view, should be, does the person have a real choice to not have sex without putting themselves in danger? And if that is true, I think that really should be the standard. I do have some thoughts about the whole eroticization of inequality thing, but we don't really have time to go into that now. So
the gentleman up there makes a very important point about the belief that a defendant has to have before he can be guilty of rape. Does he have to believe on reasonable grounds as the law says at the moment, that a woman is consenting, or should it be sufficient, as it used to be, that he just did believe, even if on unreasonable grounds? It's an important academic argument. I have to say, in practice, it's not something which very often, in my experience, features in cases about consent, because juries look at the facts and all the sort of issues and circumstances around a particular sexual encounter, I think, rather more than they concentrate on what is actually, to them, I think, quite a fine distinction. So whilst I do tend to agree with you in principle, and I think the Law Commission actually never recommended that change in the law, it sort of crept in during the parliamentary process. In practice, I think it's something which I was referring to, a problem rather around the edges of consent rather than at the centre of it. About Alison Saunders, well, I don't know. She goes up and down in my estimation. I thought she was very brave over Lord Janner, and she was overruled in the end. This enthusiastic and beautiful. I'll go away and read this article. I cannot believe that she said that consent has to be enthusiastic and beautiful before it's acceptable in law. I mean, it's just poppycock nonsense. So perhaps I'm wrong. If she really did say that, then, well...
It's scary stuff.
Perhaps she should be thinking of going back to law school, because that's just ridiculous.
The unbelievable keeps happening. And finally, Luke, with 1 minute.
Just two very quick points. The first, I think the question down the front raised a very frightening spectre, I'm afraid, when you said consent is irrelevant. I think you're hinting at a broader trend where really, when we're dealing with particularly cases of historical abuse, we really say the rules don't really matter in these cases. What matters is that these people achieve some sense of justice for themselves. That's a very dangerous trajectory, because I think in all sorts of ways in which we deal with these cases, we've changed and bent the laws, for example, around Greville Janner, in order to ensure that the complainants in these cases feel as though the justice system has paid attention to them. That's very dangerous. If we bend and change the rule of law in order to suit what complainants perceive to be their demands, I think that's extremely worrying. And I think we need to start from the point of view that actually there is a social value to prosecutions, there's a social purpose to the justice system, which goes beyond individual complainants' feelings, frankly. Secondly, just very quickly on the experience of the head teacher. I mean, I think young people are in an incredibly difficult position, because on the one hand, they're told that intimacy is very dangerous. I think that an intimate relationship opens you up to the potential of abuse, that you're all potentially domestically violent. And on the other hand, they get told about pornography and about the pornification of society. It's not difficult to see why young people are so obsessed with porn. If people around them are telling them so often that intimacy and sex is dangerous. So I think that the starting point needs to be that, especially when talking to young people, is that really it's okay to keep some things in private. And I think that's the line I'll finish on.
There's shaking heads, there's tutting. That's just what we like to see at the end of the first session of the Battle of Ideas. So can we finish by giving our panel a huge round of applause?